Today I'm going to be taking apart a T-5 transmission to sort out a shifting issue. If all goes well, I'm also going to see what it takes to install a Mustang shifter on a Camaro transmission. Welcome back to the garage, guys. Thanks for tuning in. As I said in the intro, we're going to be trying to diagnose some shifting issues in our Borg-Warner T-5. Now, a little background on this transmission. It was actually born in a 1985 GTA Trans Am. Pretty cool car. I picked it up a few years ago for the straight shift swap I did in my wife's 1986 Monte Carlo SS. Best decision ever for that car, by the way. So it's actually a pretty good transmission. It's not all that different from the T-5 and the Mustang outside of a little bit of difference in the bolt pattern and of course that shifter. So let's talk a little bit about what's wrong with this transmission. Somebody may have been out doing some spirited driving in the vehicle and missed a gear change. And at that point the transmission actually stuck in, I believe, third gear. Well, it took two hands and some force, but I managed to get it out of third gear. It seemed to go to second, and I was able to get home and kind of free things up. Ever since then, intermittently, it's just jammed in random gears. Sometimes jams in neutral, sometimes first, second, third. It's really weird what it's doing, and I've had a lot of T5 Fords. I've never encountered this. I don't know if that plays a role, but today we're going to take it apart and find out. So the first step in disassembling a T5 is to remove this roll pin. It's kind of neat how it does. You just drive it down into the tail housing and it kind of hangs out in there until later when you take all this apart. The next thing I like to do is I pull the bolts out of the shift cap. Now this isn't necessary at this point, but it does give me a little more room to wiggle things as I take it apart. Something to take note of is that two of these bolts have very large shoulders. They're actually what is used to center the shift cap on the main case. Just make sure you don't lose those because they're probably hard to find. The next thing I do is I like to stand the transmission up on the front end, kind of balance between the case and that front bearing retainer on the edge of my workbench. This kind of helps me get a little bit better control of it as I'm removing these bolts from the tail housing. Just be careful when you're doing this. The last thing you want to do is let it slip and fall off in the floor and break the transmission, or worse, hurt yourself. Once you get all these bolts out, the next step is to go ahead and find something sharp, like a flathead screwdriver, and just kind of wedge it in between the tail housing and the main case to break that seal of silicone that's holding everything together. Once you get it freed up, go ahead and lift the tail housing off the shaft, being mindful of that shifter assembly in there because all that stuff will come apart and go everywhere if you're not careful. Now that you've got the tail housing off the transmission, you can see that roll pin you drove out earlier. Also, you'll find a ball and a spring in there that's used for a detent. Try not to lose this stuff, and whatever you do, don't do what I did. That's a good way to break a tail housing right there. So with the bolts removed from the shift cap and the tail housing off, it's the moment of truth. Let's see what I broke. So for all three of you guys that are still running these old school transmissions like me, this is the point you really want to take these things down to see what the internals look like. You really want to have a good understanding of a transmission if you buy one used. You don't really want to buy these things on blind faith. With the shift cap removed, so far everything looks pretty good. The synchronizers are all doing what they're supposed to do. I don't see any carnage, I don't see any metal, I don't see anything broken. I'm going to have a closer look at the shift cap itself and see if I see anything. The shift forks all have this little plastic on there. It's not worn down too far or anything. And again, I don't see any signs of marred up metal because I'm going to tell you, when this thing sticks, it is stuck. I don't know. I think there's only one thing left to do. We're going to have to call a transmission expert. Fortunately for me, I have a transmission professional on speed dial. Let's give him a call and see what he says. Hey, man.
Hey.
I'm in search of a transmission professional. Have you seen one?
Yeah, well, yeah, I happen to know one.
All right. Can you ask him some questions for me?
Sure.
So I got this T-5 out of this Monte Carlo, and I'm not really finding a problem with the shifter.
Right.
So I know it jams up because I've driven the car and it's jammed up 20 times now. But I don't see any metal. I don't see anything burred up. I don't have any kind of synchronizers that show like they're worn. What do you think's going on with it?
Well, usually in the shift cap, if you flip the cap upside down, where the shift forks are, you'll see the shift gate and the shift selector that goes into the gate of those shift forks. Sometimes that flat pin that's on that shift gate mechanism will twist, and if it gets loose and twists around at all, it's supposed to have zero movement. In fact, the later model T5s came out updated to where it was all one piece, but it wasn't a two-piece mechanism anymore.
So you're saying I shouldn't be able to pull that part out and look at it?
You should not be able to pull that. If you can pull that out and look at it, then you've got a problem.
Yeah, we have Houston, we have a problem. So what do you recommend? Do you think we can upgrade to the later version, or is there a part, or should I just try to fix what I have?
Well, you can attempt to try to fix what you have, but note that it is under pressure when you do shift. So that is what shifts it. I mean, if I was to do anything, you could tap the hole and try to close it in by hitting with a steel hammer, and you can actually booger the hole to where you might could get it to press in. You need a good press fit, and you need to be sure it's parallel and square so that it's in the right spot.
Right.
So
that's my kind of solution. I like solutions that involve a hammer.
Right, I figured you would.
All right. Well, I'm going to try that.
Well, you may try some, a good epoxy to go in there with it.
Right.
Knock it in good. And if you could just put a little tack weld around it, press it in and then just tack weld it a little bit. Even if you have to grind the weld down a little bit, that'll probably hold it enough. But you don't want to get your weld too much to where it interferes with the shift.
Right, because it would get in the way from what I see.
Right, it can.
All right.
There is a little bit of area that you probably could weld it. Just
not much.
Weld it just a little.
So.
But the best thing to do is replace it, of course.
Well, can I replace it with a later version?
You can yes.
Do you have one?
I do have one.
We may need to discuss this further. All right, well, brother, I appreciate the help with the transmission. I'm going to explore some repair.
Anytime I can help Dickie's Garage, I'm always there.
Right? Well, I appreciate you helping out Dickie's Garage because, as you know, we are financially challenged. And
yeah, and the #1 rated YouTube.
Yes, all three of you guys watching this right now know that you're the reason I am #1 rated.
That is right.
Right, out of 3. All right, guys. Well, I definitely appreciate the help, Mike. I am going to try to explore this a little bit further, and I will give you a call if I need that updated part.
Thanks, sir.
Thank you. Have a good night.
You too.
YouTube? Yeah, well, that's what we're on. All right, so you heard it from Mike. This little shit right here may be the problem. I don't know if you guys can see this, but there's really nothing wrong with it. It looks fine, other than the fact it's not installed in this piece here. So I don't know if you guys can see this, but there's a little hole, and that sits in the hole. Problem being, that's not supposed to move in the hole. So what was happening is when that square locator pin was turned at an angle, it was suddenly wider and wouldn't fit back out of the same hole it went into. That's why I'm having to force and bang on the shifter to get it where I want to go. So what I'm going to do is probably go ahead and try to weld that and see if I can't make it stay in one place. Alright, so that turned out pretty good if I may say so myself. What I did is I welded just a little bit in the front and a little bit in the back, and then I ground it all down nice and smooth so that I can still get that shifter pin through those gates. I think that's the solution we were looking for. So now that I've got that pin secured, next thing to do is to go ahead and clean up this case, reseal all this, and see if it'll shift. So the shift cap is easy enough to get back on, but here's where it gets a little tricky. Remember that spring and ball I showed you in the shift mechanism? Now you've got to layer it together underneath this big block of metal here and hold it in as you run that shaft through this housing into that hole to hold all that together. So when you put this thing together, you kind of have to have a little finesse and work it down on there while holding your thumb over that mechanism. It's a bit of a trick. It may take me more than one try. Alright, so I've got my sealant on the tail housing, and I'm going to work this down here, and I've got my thumb holding the end of this shifter together so that when I come through the hole, everything will line up nice. Go ahead and start just a couple of bolts here so this doesn't back off on me. Now I just got to make sure my dowel pin's lined up, which is looking pretty good, and we're going to put this roll pin right back in that shifter mechanism. So just for testing purposes, I'm going to go ahead and stick a couple of bolts in this original shifter and try to run it through the gears just to make sure I got everything assembled right. It's a lot easier to find this out now than it would be after I get it installed in the car. Yeah, I think it works. So all the gears are there and it's not binding at the moment. So I'm going to act like that's fixed and move on to this shifter project. So the shifter I decided to use for this project is just an old used Hurst shifter. It's just kind of the run-of-the-mill shifter, nothing special. It's got some end stops and it's definitely got some exaggerated pivot points to give it that short throw feel. So the problem is the original shifter, the bolt pattern is a lot more of a square. I mean, it's not a square, but it's more of a square. This thing is just a bit longer. So check them out side by side. You can see that it's obviously a bit longer. So what I figured I was going to do is just stick this on the hole, mark the holes, and then drill some new bolt holes and cut the front of it off. Turns out it's going to be a little more complicated than that, and that may be why a lot more people aren't using this. So I noticed the problem as soon as I put it on the transmission. You put it on here, it's rocking. The pivot ball and the shaft on the bottom of the shifter is just a little bit longer than the Chevy version. So it's a problem, but I don't think it's one we can't overcome. So essentially what I'm going to have to do is build some kind of spacer to bring the shifter up just a little bit so that that pivot ball is not jammed down in the transmission. I think I've got just the thing to build that spacer out of too. So what I decided to do was take the factory GM shifter and cut the mounting flange off of it. It turns out this mounting flange already has the correct bolt pattern and it's the right thickness I need to get that shifter elevated up off that tail housing. So once I had this flange cleaned up, I put it on the bottom of my Hurst shifter, lined it up where it needed to go, and drilled and bored 4 new holes in it. So my plan is when I'm installing all this, I'll put a layer of sealant on, put this flange on the transmission, put another layer of sealant on top of that, and then bolt my shifter on. There's no real fluid pressure here, it's just splashing fluid, so it should seal up just fine. So let's stick all this together and see if it works. So I've got my spacer I'm going to put on here. I've got my slightly modified Hurst shifter. We're going to slide that in there and then throw a couple of bolts in it and see if it will shift gears, preferably without hanging up in between gears. Feels like a shifter to me. So there you have it. We've potentially repaired this Borg-Warner T-5 and slightly modified a Mustang shifter to fit this Chevy Trans and installed an abnormally long shifter stick. But man, it shifts nice. Look at this. Oh, you can't beat that. So I've got to do a little bit more work tidying this up. I'll deal with that once I get it installed in the car, which may actually be a couple of weeks yet because there's the engine sitting right there. That's right, I didn't just take the transmission out, I completely ripped the car apart. That's going to be a whole nother project right there, but as far as this one goes, guys, I'm going to call this one done. As always, thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe.